One of Donald Trump's long-standing grievances, echoed by several American presidents over the past 2 or 3 decades, has been the decline in defense spending among European NATO allies. While the current administration may voice this frustration more bluntly than its predecessors, it's true that many European nations have reduced their military budgets over time. What often gets left out of this narrative, however, is a crucial piece of context: the enormous financial and humanitarian burden European countries have shouldered as a direct result of America's post-World War II military campaigns. From deploying troops and equipment to America's wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, to managing the long-term consequences of mass migration from conflict zones, Europe has paid far more than is often acknowledged. Ever since NATO was founded, it has really only come to the aid of one of its members, which was the US after 9/11. Not only that, but the US has also dragged several of its biggest allies into many other wars, with the conflicts in Iraq being 2 infamous examples. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, and in this episode, we'll look at 2 things which American administrations often completely overlook when it comes to complaining about Europe's defense spending, one being the fact that Europe has spent a lot of both money and blood in American forever wars, and the fact that Europe has often carried the brunt of the fallout when hundreds of millions of people were displaced and streamed into Europe after the American-led wrecking ball had been through their home nations. Let's start by examining how much Europe's allies have spent supporting the 3 most infamous US-led wars in the Middle East. Then we'll turn to the long-term consequences, specifically the massive wave of migration triggered by these conflicts and their aftermath. Ironically, US Vice President J.D. Vance now seems to blame Europe for this migration, despite the fact that almost none of the displaced people from these wars have ended up in the United States. In the Gulf War, it is estimated that European allies spent anywhere between 30 to 40 billion euros on aiding the American-led invasion of Iraq. In current-day value, that would likely be well over 100 billion. The UK likely dug the deepest and deployed the largest contingent of European troops, with over 40,000 troops actively fighting in the war, almost their entire air and naval fleets, as well as the entire 1st Armored Division. While it is hard to pinpoint an exact figure here, historians suggest that the expense incurred for the UK alone ranged between 6 to 10 billion pounds by that day's standard, which was over a fourth of the UK's total defense budget. Germany, likely the 2nd largest contributor financially to the Gulf War, contributed at least 6 billion euros in financial aid to its allies, while also supplying a large amount of logistical capacity with its bases and airfields. France contributed approximately 20,000 personnel, 14 ships, 75 aircraft, and at least 350 armored vehicles. And while sources on the cost of this war to France are hard to find, a rough estimate likely puts France's contribution close to that of Germany, with around 6 billion euros, before you count in wear and tear on its military assets. Perhaps one of our French subscribers can dig out an exact figure. Furthermore, Italy, Norway, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Netherlands, Belgium, and Canada also deployed different kinds of active assets to the theater, with the top end of these nations being the Dutch contribution of 2 frigates, several air defense teams, 3 mine hunters, and a field hospital coming in at around 400 million euros in 1990s money, ranging all the way down to Portugal's smaller naval contribution costing somewhere around 100 million. Many more nations, like Sweden, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland, contributed with smaller medical teams, ranging from 5 to 20 million. Importantly, the Gulf War only lasted 100 days, which is less than 5% of the Iraq War and less than 2% of the almost 20-year war in Afghanistan. 12 years after the Gulf War ended, the Iraq War began when President George W. Bush claimed that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, an assertion that was later proven false, as no such weapons were ever found. While Saddam had used chemical weapons against the Kurds, no proof was ever found of atomic weaponry. The invasion was also framed as part of the broader War on Terror following the 9/11 attacks, despite Iraq having no direct connection to al-Qaeda. The conflict kicked off with a massive aerial bombing campaign, followed by a rapid ground invasion that quickly pushed coalition forces toward Baghdad. Within weeks, Saddam's government was overthrown. However, the fall of the regime created a power vacuum that led to years of violent insurgency, civil unrest, and the eventual emergence of extremist groups like ISIS. Indirectly, this war led to unrest in the entire region and caused the massive issues still seen today in countries like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The Iraq War placed a substantial financial, political, and human burden on many of the United States' European allies, several of whom committed both troops and resources to the invasion and the years of occupation that followed. While the United States shouldered the largest share of the costs, countries like the United Kingdom, Italy, Poland, Denmark, Spain, and others contributed significantly, often under domestic political pressure and international scrutiny. Incidentally, the Iraq War was the first war in a while where clear allies of the US did not want to participate, including Germany, France, and Canada. For those of you who are as grey and old as myself, you might remember how France was mocked in the US and the UK for refusing to take part in the Iraq War. French fries were famously renamed Freedom Fries, and American consumers launched boycotts of French products. But looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that France, along with Canada and Germany, made the right call in choosing not to participate in a war based on false premises. As the second largest contributor after the US, the UK deployed over 45,000 troops at the war's outset and maintained a presence until 2009. The UK Ministry of Defence estimated the direct cost of its operations in Iraq at £8.4 billion, but when factoring in long-term veteran care, equipment wear, and indirect costs, the total rises considerably. The political fallout was severe, leading to widespread public backlash and the eventual Chilcot inquiry, which heavily criticized the government's justification for entering the war. Italy deployed about 3,200 troops to southern Iraq and remained part of the coalition until 2006. The cost of Italy's involvement is estimated at €2 billion, excluding long-term liabilities. Italy also suffered domestic terrorism attacks in response to its participation, as well as the 2003 bombing in Nasiriyah that killed 19 Italian servicemen and civilians. Along with Greece, Italy is likely one of the countries in Europe which has carried the biggest brunt of the immigration due to the rise of ISIS after this war, but more on that later. Poland played a key role in the coalition, taking command of a multinational zone in southern Iraq, with around 2,500 troops deployed at its peak, including their much-praised Tier 1 Special Operations Team named GROM. Warsaw's estimated cost of participation was $1.5 billion, a significant burden on its relatively smaller defense budget in 2003. Denmark contributed around 550 troops at its peak and provided logistical and intelligence support. Though small in scale, its role came at an estimated cost of 400 to 700 million. Denmark's involvement also drew domestic controversy, especially after it was revealed that its intelligence assessments had closely mirrored US claims about WMDs. Spain initially sent around 1,300 troops to Iraq, but following the 2004 Madrid train bombings, directly linked to Spain's involvement in the war, and a shift in government, Spanish forces were withdrawn just over a year into the occupation. Despite the short deployment, costs are estimated to have reached 300 to 500 million, and Spain's public opinion was overwhelmingly against the war from the outset. As with the first Gulf War, many more nations provided both military, logistical, and financial support to the Allied coalition. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the most expensive war in most recent times, namely the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001, just weeks after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when the United States, supported by a broad international coalition, launched Operation Enduring Freedom to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. What was initially framed as a targeted counter-terrorism mission quickly evolved into a 20-year nation-building effort, the longest war in US and NATO history. Over 50 NATO and partner countries, including most of Europe and even non-NATO countries like Sweden, Finland, Ukraine, Georgia and Austria, contributed troops and resources through the International Security Assistance Force. The war officially ended on August 30, 2021, with the chaotic withdrawal of US and allied forces and the rapid return of the Taliban to power, essentially wiping out the work that had been done in 20 years within a few short weeks. Financially, the war cost the US alone over $2.3 trillion, with European allies contributing hundreds of billions more in military operations, development aid, and reconstruction. Human costs were also staggering. Over 170,000 people were killed, including approximately 3,500 coalition troops, over 70,000 Afghan military and police personnel, around 47,000 civilians, and more than 50,000 Taliban and insurgent fighters. If we dive into the top 10 European contributors, both in terms of financial and human cost in Afghanistan, the numbers show that a lot of them spent a massive part of their military budgets on this war, while several of them were also contributing to the war in Iraq at the same time. The United Kingdom was the largest European contributor to the war in Afghanistan, deploying over 100,000 personnel over 2 decades. British forces were heavily engaged in some of the most intense combat zones, particularly in Helmand province. The UK suffered 457 fatalities, the highest among European nations. Financially, the mission cost Britain an estimated £44 billion, including combat operations, development aid, and long-term veteran care, before you count in the wear and tear on the hundreds of vehicles and equipment deployed. Germany's role in Afghanistan focused heavily on stabilization, reconstruction, and military training. With the peak deployment of around 5,300 troops, Germany concentrated its efforts in northern provinces like Kunduz and Mazar-i-Sharif. 59 German troops lost their lives during the conflict. The estimated financial cost of Germany's involvement stands at 15 to 20 billion, making it the second largest European contributor in financial terms. Italy maintained a strong military and reconstruction presence in Afghanistan, particularly in the western provinces of Herat and Farah. At its peak, Italy deployed around 5,000 troops. Italian forces also took command of several NATO operations in their sectors. 53 Italian soldiers died during the mission. The estimated financial burden is believed to be between 9 and 12 billion. France played a major role in the early stages of the war and contributed up to 4,000 troops at its height. French forces were mainly stationed in Kabul and the eastern provinces, with the French Foreign Legion facing some of the heaviest fighting in the country. In 2012, France became one of the first major contributors to withdraw its combat troops. The war claimed the lives of 89 French soldiers, and the country's financial investment is estimated at 8 to 13 billion euros. The Netherlands and Poland were both significant contributors to NATO's mission in Afghanistan. The Dutch deployed around 2,000 troops in Uruzgan province, focusing on reconstruction and joint security operations. They suffered 25 casualties and spent an estimated 4 billion. Poland deployed up to 2,600 troops in Ghazni province, engaged in combat and training missions. With 44 soldiers lost, Poland's financial contribution is estimated at 2 billion euros. The Dutch figure is higher because they deployed a lot of expensive equipment like fighter jets, while the Poles leaned heavily into infantry and mechanized units. Despite its relatively small size, Denmark played an outsized role in Afghanistan, deploying up to 750 troops and earning one of the highest casualty rates per capita among NATO contributors. Danish forces operated in Helmand province and took part in likely the toughest frontline combat alongside British troops. Denmark suffered 43 military fatalities. The financial cost is estimated at around 1 billion euros, covering deployments, equipment, and support operations. Now that Donald Trump is threatening Greenland and Denmark almost weekly, the blood, sweat, and cost suffered by the brave Danish contingent seems like a massive waste. To round off our top 10, Norway and the Czech Republic made meaningful contributions to the Afghan mission, particularly in reconstruction and support roles. Norway deployed around 500 troops, primarily in Faryab province. It suffered 10 fatalities and spent an estimated 1 billion. The Czech Republic deployed up to 700 troops, providing special forces, field hospitals, and military police, mainly in Logar and Parvan provinces. With 14 casualties, the Czech effort cost an estimated 500 million euros. Beyond the top contributors, a broad range of other European nations, including Belgium, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Sweden, and as I mentioned in my video on defense spending and my own tour in Afghanistan, which I'll link to in the description, Finland also took part to varying degrees. Together, their combined contributions added an estimated 5 to 10 billion euros in additional costs to the European effort. Now, moving on to a topic which can be quite touchy to some, I just want to clarify, this is not a video where I profess either support or condemnation of the mass immigration that these wars caused, but it is nonetheless an important factor that will need to be discussed. So before you start raging in my comments either way, please know that whatever comes next is purely a statement of what happened and the consequences of the damage that these wars caused in the Middle East. The wars in the Middle East, particularly the 2003 invasion of Iraq, created a power vacuum that directly contributed to the rise of ISIS. As the US-led coalition toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, sectarian violence exploded and instability spread across Iraq and into Syria. When the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, ISIS capitalized on the chaos, seizing territory and triggering widespread terror, executions, and persecution of ethnic and religious minorities. The collapse of institutions in both Iraq and Syria, compounded by the US-led intervention in Libya and prolonged instability in Afghanistan, led to one of the largest waves of displacement since World War II. Millions of civilians fled violence, persecution, and economic ruin, and as much as 90% of these refugees flocked to Europe. While America in many cases caused this damage, it was Europe who was left with the mess they had caused. Even the most moderate voices on the European left are beginning to reckon with the chaos and long-term challenges that the 2015 migration crisis has brought. Take the three countries that received the largest number of migrants, Germany, Sweden, and France, as examples. In Sweden, the political landscape has shifted dramatically to the right, with even the traditionally dominant Social Democrats acknowledging the need for stricter laws amid the country's worst ever wave of gang-related violence. Germany faces many of the same issues, including a rise in knife attacks, terrorist incidents at public gatherings like Christmas markets, and growing support for the far-right AfD, particularly in the economically weaker eastern regions. In France, the political right has gained more ground than at any time since World War II, reflecting a broader continental shift driven by public concern over security, integration, and social cohesion. So, when American leaders accuse Europe of not pulling its weight in NATO, we have to ask, what about the hundreds of billions spent by European allies in America's wars? What about the thousands of European lives lost and the millions of refugees absorbed, not by the US, but by its closest allies at a cost which dwarfs the US defense budget? From the front lines of Iraq and Afghanistan to the political fallout still reshaping Europe today, the cost has been steep and overwhelmingly European. I'll stop ranting now and wish all of you a wonderful weekend. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll leave the links to the videos mentioned here in the description. May you have a peaceful, sunny spring weekend, wherever you are.